In the silent void of the outer belt, beneath a shattered sky, a man searching for spare parts uncovers more than wreckage. He finds her, abandoned, broken breathing. And with that breath, a chain of defiance is set in motion. This is not just salvage. It's the start of a revolution neither of them expected. The orbital graveyard was silent, except for the distant groan of shifting metal in the wind. Kyle Virex moved carefully, his boots crunching over rusted debris, the scent of burned circuitry and ozone thick in the air. He had been to places like this before: Star-Deep Range, scout vessel, graveyards, abandoned mining, abandoned relay stations, battlefields where history had been left to rot. They were all the same in the end, forgotten remnants of things that no longer mattered, except something here did. At first he thought it was just another piece of wreckage, a smooth curve of metal, half buried beneath shattered hull plating. But then he saw it move, a slow blink, a flicker of golden light, beneath tangled black hair. His body tensed. He wasn't alone. Kale's hand instinctively hovered near the sidearm, strapped to his thigh. But he didn't draw it. Not yet. Instead, he took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the shape before him. As the wind shifted, the rest of her came into view. She wasn't human. Her skin, a deep violet, like bruised dusk, was streaked with grime and old wounds. Her hair, black as the void beyond the stars, clung to her face in tangled strands. Her body was motionless, half buried in debris, not in the way of someone injured, but someone abandoned. Kyle let out a slow breath, his pulse steady, but his thoughts racing. Who the hell was she? And why had someone left her here to die? Then she spoke. "Help me." The word was soft, too soft for someone who should be screaming for survival. There was no panic, no desperation, just exhaustion, resignation. Kale crouched beside her, his instincts warring with his caution. Up close he could see more, the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the faint shimmer of gold in her eyes, the tightness in her jaw that spoke of someone too proud to beg, but too broken to fight. "Can you move?" he asked. Her gaze flickered toward him, studying him the way a wounded animal might assess whether the hand reaching for it meant salvation or more pain. Then her lips parted, no a single word, flat and final. Kyle's fingers curled into his palm. There is something about that answer that unsettled him. Not just what she said, but how she said it. Not with fear, not with anger, with certainty. Like she had already accepted that she would never move again. His eyes swept over her, assessing her condition. No fresh wounds, no visible breaks, but the way she lay, asterisk, rigid, unnatural, fresh asterisk made something click in his mind. She wasn't just injured, she was paralyzed. Kale's jaw tightened. That changed everything. He reached out his fingers, hovering just above her arm, waiting to see if she would flinch. When she didn't, he placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Who did this to you?" A long silence stretched between them. "Then my family." Kyle went still. Of all the answers he had expected, that wasn't one of them. His grip on her shoulder tightened slightly before he forced himself to relax. It's seen a lot in his time. War, betrayal, people turning on their own for power, for money, for survival, but leaving someone paralyzed in a orbital graveyard to die. That was a new level of cruelty. A part of him wanted a push to demand answers. But another part, asterisk, the part that recognized the weight of her words, the finality in her voice. Asterisk knew this wasn't the time. Instead, he exhaled slowly and looked around. There are no footprints, no signs of a struggle. Whoever had left her here hadn't done it in a hurry. They had taken their time, ensuring there was no way she could crawl to safety, no way she could be found, unless someone like him happened to stumble across her. Someone who actually gave a damn. Cale turned back to her. She was watching him, unreadable, her gaze flickering with something he couldn't quite place. "All right," he said, shifting his stance. "I'm getting you out of here." Something in her expression shifted too quick for him to catch. Surprise, skepticism, but she didn't protest. He moved carefully, lifting the rusted scrap that had settled over her legs. It was heavier than he expected, the corroded metal groaning as he pushed it aside. When he reached for her, he hesitated. "I'm gonna carry you. That okay?" For a second, she didn't respond. Then she gave the barest nod. Cale slid one arm under her back, the other beneath her legs, and lifted her. She was light, but not fragile. He could feel the wiry strength beneath her skin, the lingering tension in her muscles. Even now, she wasn't letting herself go limp. Even broken, she refused to be helpless, but the moment he took his first step, he felt it. The way she tensed against him, not in fear, not in pain, in resistance. Cale let out a slow breath. He'd seen this before, the instinct to fight, even when the battle was already lost. He'd had that same instinct once. He adjusted his grip slightly, making sure she was secure. "You got a name?" She hesitated. Then finally, "Serenia." Cale nodded. "Well, Serenia, I'm Cale Virex. He glanced down at her, smirking slightly. "And you're lucky as hell that I'm the one who found you." She let out a soft breath. Not quite a laugh, but close. Cale carried her away from the wreckage toward his deep-range scout vessel, toward safety, toward something she probably hadn't had in a long, long time. A future. The first thing Serenia noticed when she woke was the warmth. It wrapped around her like something foreign, something unnatural. The orbital graveyard had been cold, an endless gnawing cold that had seeped in her bones and made a home there, but now she felt the faint hum of a generator, the soft resistance of a cot beneath her, the scent of metal and old wiring in the air. She was inside. For a moment she lay still, gathering her thoughts. Her body remained heavy, motionless from the waist down, but there was no pain. There hadn't been for a long time, just the dull, ever-present absence of what should have been. She opened her eyes. The room was small, cluttered, salvaged tech, lined the walls, stacked in neat piles next to worn-out tools. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows across the floor. Against one wall, a terminal glowed dimly, hands of data scrolling across the screen in a language she didn't recognize. And then Cale Virex sat a few feet away, his back to her. He was hunched over a workbench, sleeves rolled up, hands working methodically over something mechanical. His movements were precise, practiced, like a man used to fixing things. The realization sent a strange pang through her. She wasn't something to be fixed. She shifted slightly, and a faint rustling of fabric caught his attention. He turned, eyes sharp, assessing. "You're awake," he said. His voice was steady, unreadable. Not cold, but not exactly warm either. Just solid. Serenia met his gaze, but said nothing. She had expected many things from this moment. Interrogation, pity, maybe even anger. What she hadn't expected was silence. Cale set down his tools, leaning back in his chair. Figured you'd sleep longer, he said, nodding toward the blanket draped over her legs. You were out for a while. She swallowed her throat dry. Where are we? My deep-range scout vessel, he replied, or what's left of it. He gestured vaguely to the ceiling, scrapyard about 2 clicks out. This place used to be an abandoned relay station. Power's unreliable, but it's shelter. Her eyes flicked back to his workbench. The half-assembled machinery in front of him wasn't a weapon. It was an armor. It was a frame. Exoskeletal supports. Realization dawned. You're wasting your time, she said flatly. Kale raised a brow. Didn't ask for your opinion. She bristled, irritation cutting through the fog of exhaustion. I haven't walked in years, and her jaw clenched, and nothing's going to change that. Kyle leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied her gaze, steady but unreadable. She had seen looks like that before. Calculating, judging, waiting for her to prove her worth. But there was something different in his expression. Not expectation, conviction. You don't know that, he said simply. She let out a sharp breath. You don't understand. My people. I know exactly what your people think. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it now. They left you to rot in a junkyard. There were excuses they gave himself for that. I don't give a damn. Escari stiffened. Kael ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Look, I'm not here to fix your life. You don't want help. Fine. But I do things my way. And right now my way is getting this thing working. He gestured toward the half-built exoskeleton. You don't have to like it. You just have to use it. The audacity of him. Asterisk, asterisk, this human, this nobody, asterisk, asterisk, telling her what she had to do made something hot flare in her chest. She opened her mouth to snap back, but before she could, a small device on his workbench beeped. Kyle glanced at it, then stood, stretching. You're probably hungry, he said, ignoring the tension between them like it wasn't even there. There's food in the galley. Not great, but better than starving. She didn't respond. With a shrug, he turned and walked toward the door. Just before stepping out, he paused, glancing back. If you're still set on giving up, that's your choice, he said. But if you want to prove them wrong, then you need to stop acting like you're already dead. The door shut behind him, leaving her alone with the faint hum of the generator and the unfinished exoskeleton gleaming under the flickering light. Iskari's clencher fists. Damn him. The electrical front rolled in fast. Kyle had seen it coming hours ago. A wall of dark clouds creeping across the horizon, thick with static, and the promise of chaos. By the time the first crack of thunder split the sky, he and Iskaris had already sealed themselves inside the abandoned relay station, the wind howling against the metal walls like a living thing. Inside, the air was tense, not because of the electrical front, because of them. It had been 2 days since Iskari's first try, the exoskeleton. 2 days of frustration, trial and error, of her fighting against the machine and against herself. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her words were sharp-edged with irritation. She had never been helpless before. She had never needed anyone, and now she hated every second of it. Kale got it. He did, but that didn't make her any easier to deal with. Across the room, Iskari sat on the cot, her back straight, arms crossed over her chest. Her gaze flicked toward him, unreadable as ever. The dim glow of the emergency lights cast shadows over her violet skin, accentuating the tension in her jaw. She was restless, trapped, and Kyle had a feeling it wasn't just the electrical front keeping her from relaxing. He dropped into the chair near the workbench and ran a hand through his hair. You're thinking too much. Your expression barely flickered, And you weren't thinking enough. Kael gave a faint grin. I think plenty. I just don't. Let it eat me alive. Iskaris exhaled through her nose, looking away. She didn't argue, which meant she knew he was right. Outside, the wind held louder, rattling the abandoned relay station's walls. The power flickered for a second, and Kael glanced up. If the generator failed, they'd be sitting in the dark until the ion tempest passed. Great Kael would definitely help the mood. He looked back at her. You hungry? She shook her head. He stood anyway, crossing the room to grab a ration pack. He tossed it onto the cot beside her. Eat. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but after a long pause, she reached for it. A small victory. Kael sat back down, stretching his legs out. He studied her, watching the way she unwrapped the ration bar mechanically, not even paying attention to what she was doing. You want to tell me what's going on in the head of yours? She didn't answer right away. That was the difference between them. He spoke first, acted first. She waited, calculated, measured her words before letting them escape. Finally, she set the half-eaten ration bar aside. Back on my homeworld, relying on others is a weakness. She said, her voice quieter than usual. If you can't stand on your own, you don't deserve to stand at all. Kael frowned. Sounds like a great place. A bitter smirk touched her lips. That's what they'd say about you. Humans. You cling to each other. You don't survive alone. She shook her head. It's unnatural. Kael let that sit between them for a moment. Before leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees, maybe he said, or maybe we just figured out that you don't have to fight every battle alone. Iskaris looked at him, then really looked at him as if she was seeing him differently for the first time. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the power cut out. The lights died, plunging the room into total darkness. Outside, the wind screamed, shaking the walls hard enough to make the metal groan. Kael sighed. Well, that's fantastic. A few seconds later, the backup generator kicked in, bathing the room in a dim, reddish glow. Not great, but at least they weren't completely blind. Kael stood moving toward the terminal to check the system, but before he could take 2 steps, a sharp clank rang out behind him. He turned just in time to see Iskaris gripping the edge of the cot, her face twisted in frustration. She tried to stand, and she had fallen. She braced herself on the metal frame, tried to push up again, but the exoskeleton had locked the servos, frozen from the sudden movement. Her breathing was uneven, her fingers curling into fists. Kael crossed the room before he even thought about it. Hey, I don't need your help, she snapped. He stopped. Her voice had that edge again, that bite. But this time it wasn't anger, it was fear. She hated this. Hated needing him, hated feeling weak. Kael exhaled slowly. Yeah, you do. He said, his voice calm and steady. And that's fine. She clenched her jaw. Not for me. I can't argue. Instead, he crouched down in front of her, resting his arms on his knees. All right. So what do you want? She looked at him sharply, like the question that caught her off guard. What did she want? She wanted her legs to work. She wanted to be strong again. She wanted to feel like herself. And right now, the only person standing between her and the void was him. For the first time, she let herself feel the weight of that. Her body relaxed just slightly. And when Kael reached out his hand, steady, waiting, she took it. He pulled her up, his grip firm but careful. The exoskeleton adjusted, recalibrating. This time she didn't fight it. She let it work with her instead of against her. And she stood, not perfectly, not easily. But she stood. Kale's fingers tightened around hers just for a second. "Told you." He murmured a small grin, tugging at his lips. Next time, for once, she didn't argue. She just held on to him, breathing steady, heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, the ion tempest raged on. But inside, something had shifted. The ion tempest hit harder than Kale expected. Winds howled like a living thing, battering the abandoned relay station's metal walls with relentless force. The old structure groaned under the assault, and the overhead lights flickered in protest. Static electricity crackled in the air, sharp and restless. Inside, the small room felt even smaller. Kyle sat at the workbench, flipping through diagnostic readings on the exoskeleton's interface, pretending not to notice the tension thickening between them. Across the room, Iskaris was perched on the cot arms, crossed her golden eyes, locked on the floor. She'd been like this all day, sealant brooding, coiled tight like a wire, ready to snap. Not that he blamed her. The first few attempts at using the exoskeleton had been rough. She fought the machine at every step, resisting its movements instead of letting it work with her. She was frustrated, angry, and underneath it all, though she'd never admit it, afraid Kyle wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. He'd seen this before, that moment when the fight starts feeling impossible, when giving up starts to look like the easier option, so he gave her space. For now, the wind slammed into the walls again, and this time, the lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. A second later, the backup generator kicked in, bathing the space in dim red emergency lighting. Kyle sighed. Great. Across from him, Iskari shifted, barely reacting. "You good?" he asked. "I'm fine," she muttered. Kale gave a faint grin. "Yeah, you sound thrilled." Silence stretched between them. Outside, thunder rumbled like a distant explosion. The abandoned relay station shook dust drifting down from the ceiling. Kyle drummed his fingers on the workbench, then stood. "All right, enough of this." Iskaris looked up, wary. "Enough of what?" "You sitting there stewing your own thoughts," he said. "Come on." She frowned. "Come on." Where Kyle tapped the exoskeleton's frame. "We're trying again." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Not in the middle of an ion tempest." "Why not?" He shrugged. "Got nowhere else to be." "I'm not in the mood." "You think I care?" He gave her a pointed look. "You don't get better by waiting until you feel like it." Her jaw tightened, and for a second he thought she might refuse, just to be stubborn. Then finally she swung her legs over the side of the cot and reached for the exoskeleton's harness. Kyle helped her fasten the straps, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The exoskeleton hummed to life, servos whirring softly as it adjusted to her frame. He stepped back, giving her room. Iskaris exhaled slowly, then shifted her weight forward. The machine responded, adjusting with her. She pushed against it, hesitant at first, then firmer. One step, then another. Not graceful, not smooth, but controlled. She was getting better. But then, something locked up. Her right leg froze mid-step, servos stiffening, and before she could compensate, the machine gave out. Kyle moved on instinct. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms steady around her waist. Her hands gripped his shoulders tight, breath sharp against his neck. They stayed like that for a second. Just a second. Close, too close. Kale became very aware of the way her fingers dug into him, the heat of her skin against his, the tension coiled between them. Iskari stiffened. Then slowly she looked up at him. For the first time since they met, she wasn't scowling. She was watching him, studying him the way she did everything else. Watching, searching, Kyle smirked. You were right there. Her grip tightened slightly just for a moment. Then to his surprise, she let out a breath of something close to a laugh. Small, barely there, but real. Kyle raised a brow. Something funny. She shook her head. She said, voice quieter than usual. You're impossible. He grinned. You just figuring that out. Her expression softened just slightly before she pulled away. Kyle let her go, watching as she steadied herself. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't have to. She had let him catch her. That was enough. Outside, the ion tempest raged on. Inside, something else had shifted. Iskari's had never been one for patience. She had been raised among warriors, taught that strength was survival, that hesitation was weakness, that pain was nothing more than a thing to be endured. And yet here she was, gritting her teeth as the exoskeleton locked up again, refusing to move the way she needed it to. Kyle stood across from her, arms crossed, watching. He didn't interfere, didn't offer empty encouragement. He just waited. The abandoned relay station's main room was dimly lit. The faint hum of the generator, the only sound between them. Inside, the sky was still heavy with the remnants of the ion tempest, the wind occasionally howling through the cracks in the structure. Inside it was just her, the exoskeleton, and her own stubborn will. She inhaled slowly, adjusting her stance. The servos in the suit whirred as she shifted her weight, trying again. The motion was awkward, mechanical, but it held. One step, another. Her pulse pounded in her ears, a mixture of exertion and sheer frustration. She wasn't used to struggling like this. In the past, her body had been an extension of her will, strong, fast, precise. But now, she was fighting against herself. Tension crawled along her jawline as she took another step, feeling the subtle tremor in her legs. The exoskeleton supported her, but it didn't do the work for her. That was Kyle's design. She had seen his modifications, had watched him strip down an old rusted frame and rebuild it from the ground up. It wasn't meant to carry her. It was meant to push her. She hated that she needed it, but she hated losing more. Kyle tilted his head. You keep hesitating. She shot him a sharp glare. I'm not hesitating. He smirked. Really? Because from here it looks a whole lot like you're waiting for the suit to do the work. Her fingers curled into fists. It's compensating. It's helping, Kale corrected. But you're still in control. You just don't trust yourself yet. Her breath came out in a slow, measured exhale. He was right, and she hated that. She took another step. This time she focused on feeling it. The weight distribution, the way the exoskeleton adjusted, but didn't override her movement. It wasn't fighting her. It was supporting her. Her next step was smoother. Kyle's expression shifted just slightly. Not quite approval, but something close. You're getting it. She didn't respond, just kept moving. Step, step. She could feel the strain in her muscles, the dull ache in her joints. But it was a good ache, a reminder that she was still here, that she still had something to fight for. Then the stabilizer lagged. The right leg. Servo hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, throwing off her balance. The moment she felt the shift, she reacted. In the past, she would have compensated instinctively. Her body had always known how to correct itself, how to shift, how to recover, but her body wasn't the same. The exoskeleton jerked against her movements instead of with them, and suddenly the ground was rushing up to meet her. She heard Kyle move a sharp intake of breath, the start of step forward, but she didn't let him catch her. She twisted mid-fall, her arms shooting out, palms slamming into the ground as she absorbed the impact. The exoskeleton adjusted, kicking in a half-second too late, but this time she was ready for it. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself back up. Her arms trembled under the weight, muscles burning with effort, but she did it. Kale stopped in his tracks. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he grinned. That he said, nodding toward her, was damn good. She sat back on her heels, catching her breath. The exoskeleton whirred softly around her, adjusting, waiting. For the first time, it felt like an extension of her, rather than a cage. She exhaled. It could be better. Kyle let out a short laugh. It always can. But that doesn't mean it wasn't good. Then she looked at him, really looked at him. She was still standing where he had stopped, just a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her like she was something worth watching. Not like she was broken, not like she was a burden, just there, with her. Something in her chest tightened. She didn't think. She moved with a slow, deliberate motion. She shifted forward, closing the distance between them. Kyle's expression flickered, curious, surprised, but he didn't move away, didn't stop her. She reached for him, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his shirt, as she pushed herself closer until she was settled right between his legs, leaning against him, not because she had to, because she wanted to. Kyle tensed for half a second, his breath catching, but then his arms came around her, strong, steady grounding. She let her head rest against his shoulder, her hands splaying over his chest. His warmth seeped into her, pacing away something cold she hadn't even realized was still there. For a moment he just held her, then his fingers skimmed along the small of her back, slow and careful, like he was still waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she tilted her head just enough to look up at him, golden eyes meeting blue. The space between them disappeared. His lips met hers, firm but unhurried, a slow, searching kind of kiss. No urgency, no hesitation, just a quiet, undeniable pull, like gravity itself had drawn them together. Serenia felt the warmth of his breath, the roughness of his fingertips as they traced up her spine, the way his heartbeat thrummed beneath her palm. Real solid, certain she'd, deep in the kiss, shifting against him, her body pressing closer. Kyle's grip tightened, one hand sliding up to cup the back of her neck, his thumbs stroking just beneath her jaw. A soft hum left her throat, a sound she hadn't meant to make but didn't care to stop. Kyle pulled back just enough to look at her, his breath slightly uneven. "You sure about this?" She smirked, fingers tightening in his shirt. "Shut up and kiss me, human." He did. The world outside was still. The ion tempest had passed, leaving behind a sky painted in deep shades of blue and violet. The last remnants of the fading sun stretching across the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of metal and rain. And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything was quiet. Inside the abandoned relay station, Kael stirred his body warm beneath the thin blanket draped over him. His muscles ached in a way that was almost satisfying. A reminder of the long hours spent repairing training, fighting for something that had once seemed impossible, or maybe he thought. Glancing to his side, fighting for someone. Serenia laying next to him, half-curled beneath the blanket, her breathing slow and even. For once, she looked at peace. The tension that usually sat in her shoulders, the sharpness in her golden eyes, both had softened, replaced with something quieter, something she'd never allowed herself to have before. He let himself watch her for a moment, his fingers absently brushing over the back of her hand where it rested between them. Strong, calloused, scarred like his. Like someone who had spent a lifetime learning that survival meant never depending on anyone else, and yet she had chosen to depend on him. The thought settled deep in his chest, a slow warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket wrapped around him. As if sensing his gaze, Iskari stirred blinking sleep-heavy eyes before focusing on him. She didn't tense, didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a quiet breath, her lips curling just slightly. "You're staring," she murmured. Kael smirked. "You gonna fight me on that, too?" She huffed, but the amusement in her expression betrayed her. "I could. I'd win. Sure, if you want to cheat." He shifted onto his side, propping himself up on an elbow. "You always this competitive? Or is that just a Zirini thing?" Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, something old, before she answered. "We don't compete," she said. "We prove." Kael studied her for a long moment. "And what exactly are you trying to prove?" She was quiet for a beat. Then she reached for him, her fingers skimming his wrist, tracing absent patterns against the skin. "I'm still me," she said finally. His chest tightened at that, because he understood everything she had been, everything she had known, her strength, her independence. Her identity had been stripped away the moment she was left in that orbital graveyard. She hadn't just lost the ability to walk, she had lost herself. And now, piece by piece, she was taking it back. Kael shifted closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. No hesitation, no doubt, just a quiet, steady certainty that this was real. "You never stopped being you," you murmured. She didn't answer with words. She closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, not out of urgency, but understanding. Acclaiming in its own way, Kael responded in kind, deepening it just enough to feel the way her body pressed into his, her warmth sinking into him like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. By the time they pulled apart, her golden eyes were darker, searching. "We can't stay here forever," she said. Kael smirked. "You getting sick of me already?" She rolled her eyes, but there was no edge to it anymore. "I mean it. You had a deep-range scout vessel before this, a real one." "Where is it?" Kael admitted. "Still out there, buried under a whole lot of junk. But give me time, and I can get it running again." She tilted her head slightly, thoughtful, and then Kael considered that. He had come to this place looking for salvage, looking for parts, supplies, things that mattered. Then he found her, and suddenly none of that other shit seemed important anymore. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then we go, wherever the hell we want." Iskari studied him, then let out a slow breath, something shifting behind her gaze. "For the first time in my life," she murmured. "That doesn't sound like running." Kael squeezed her hand, his grip firm, solid. "Certain it's not," he said. "It's starting over, and with that, the past didn't matter anymore, because the future was theirs." The desert stretched endlessly before them, golden sand rolling into the horizon where the twin suns began their slow descent. The sky was painted in shades of deep orange and violet, fading into the first hints of night. The ion tempest was long gone, and the wind had settled, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred, a silence that spoke of new beginnings. At the base of the deep-range scout vessel, Hiskari stood without hesitation, without struggle, without the exoskeleton carrying her weight. She lifted her foot carefully, shifting her balance, and took a step, not stiff, not forced, just a step, a real one. The exoskeleton still hummed faintly, adjusting where necessary, but it no longer controlled her movements. It simply enhanced them. She no longer relied on it. She commanded it. Kael stood a few paces away, arms crossed, watching with something between admiration and smug satisfaction. "Damn," he muttered. "And here I was, getting used to carrying you around." She scoffed, rolling her eyes as she took another step just because she could. "You never had to carry me." Kael grinned. "I don't know. You sure didn't complain when you ended up in my lap?" Hiskari stopped in front of him, tilting her head slightly, eyes sharp with challenge. "I could still knock you on your ass, human." He chuckled, gaze flicking down, taking in the full picture of her standing before him, strong, unshaken, whole. "Yeah," he murmured. "I don't doubt it." There was something in his voice, something softer beneath the teasing, something real. She felt it settled deep in her chest. In the spaces she had long forgotten how to acknowledge. This wasn't survival anymore. It wasn't just about proving she could stand. It was about choosing to move forward. And when she did, it wasn't with hesitation. She closed the distance between them, stepping into a space with the same bold certainty she had once used to command warriors. Kael didn't move away. He just waited for her to make the choice, waited for her to take what she wanted. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, and before she could second-guess herself, she pulled him in. Kael barely had time to react before her lips crashed into his fierce, demanding, unapologetic. The moment their mouths met, something electric shot through her, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Kael made a low sound of surprise before responding in kind, his hands settling at her waist, steady and sure, like she belonged there. And maybe she did. He kissed her back with just as much hunger, just as much raw, unspoken emotion. His grip tightened slightly, fingers sliding against the exposed skin beneath her shirt, his warmth sinking into her. This wasn't careful. This wasn't hesitant. It was everything she hadn't allowed herself to have. The burn of something undeniable, the taste of something real, the weight of something she no longer wanted to push away. She deepened the kiss, shifting her body against his, reveling in the way his breath hitched slightly, the way his hands pulled her closer, like he never wanted to let go. It wasn't enough. She wanted more. She broke away only for a second, just enough to let out a breath, just enough to look into those damn human blue eyes that always saw through her defenses. Kael's forehead rested against hers, his breathing uneven, a lazy grin tugging at his lips. So he murmured, voice low and teasing, "I take it this means you like me." Hiskari smirked, fingers still tangled in his shirt. "It means I'm done pretending I don't." Kyle exhaled a quiet laugh, his thumb brushing along the line of her jaw. There was no hesitation in his touch, no fear, just certainty. Then he kissed her again, slower this time, but deeper, like he was memorizing the way she felt against him, like he was claiming something neither of them had words for. And she let him, because for the first time in years, she wasn't trapped in the past. She was standing in her future, and she wasn't standing alone. Later, much later, the stars stretched endlessly above them, and the deep-range scout vessel hummed softly in the background, waiting. Kyle leaned against the open ramp, watching Iskaris as she stood at the edge of the dunes, looking out at the horizon. The twin moons had risen now, casting her in silver light, making her look almost unreal, but she was real. She was here, and she had chosen to stay. He pushed off the deep-range scout vessel and walked up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, pulling her back against him. She didn't resist, simply leaned into him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Kyle pressed a slow kiss to her shoulder, then rested his chin on it. So he murmured, "Where to, warrior?" She tilted her head slightly, her golden eyes flickering in the moonlight. "Wherever the hell we want." And as the deep-range scout vessel's engines roared to life, they stepped forward together, this time into a future they chose.